in Washington, and I don't always wear a collar, but we are up on Capitol Hill today and doing visits with refugees themselves and other people with lived experience of forced displacement through Refugee Council USA, of which Church World Service is a member. And we are, asking today, we're up on the Hill asking for support for the refugee resettlement program, including ample funding, as well as other pieces of legislation that we support, like the Afghan Adjustment Act and Refugee Protection Act, amongst a few. And we can talk more about what all those things are as we go, but just wanted to let you know why I'm calling in from a church today. And it's been pretty cool to see about 300 constituents, coming into DC for this cause. So with that, we want to jump into, Church World Service is the only resettlement organization with a community organizing program. And our area is focused around particularly refugees and other people with the lived experience of forced displacement, or populations from the Office of Refugee Resettlement, eligible populations. So, but there's also a mix of folk from various statuses. We even work with undocumented people as well as people with diversity visa and people who come on a family visa. And I think there is a really important unity that comes with that. And we all know that faith communities, that part of our tradition across different faiths really is, welcoming the sojourner in our midst. And really now these folks aren't necessarily, a lot of people have been here many years now and are part of our community, part of our congregations. And then there's also many newcomers coming in. And how do we be in solidarity, and how do we be in accompaniment? How do we utilize the storytelling power of people impacted by these issues? And that is going to be the main focus of what we're talking about today. And I see that my colleague Mirna Rosco, who's our organizing coordinator, is on the call. And so I'm going to kick it over to her to introduce herself, and then kind of talk a little bit more about how our organizing program works.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. Nice to virtually meet you. As Noel mentioned, my name is Mirna Orozco. I'm an organizing coordinator based out of Richmond, Texas, really close to Houston. For those of you who are not familiar with the state of Texas, I've been working with a CWS for about 7 years now, and really excited to be able to join you all and talk a little bit more about what partnership and allyship looks like. I got my start organizing in faith communities. I grew up in the church, and that was what really, formed me into being able to be someone who wanted to be the hands and feet of Christ. And so that is how I ended up in organizing and trying to make sure that the work that we were doing was faith in action to support all communities. And at CWS, we've been able to do that through some of the programs that we're going to go through today. We actually have some slides talking a little bit more about community organizing and what that is, as well as the work that we do specifically in our program. So I'm going to go ahead and kick it back just so that we can go in order and don't mess up the lovely slides that our awesome team put together. But just wanted to quickly introduce myself, and I use she, her, yeah pronouns as well.
Thank you, Noel, and thank you, Myrna. And as you saw, Church World Service is a faith-based organization transforming communities around the globe through just and sustainable responses to hunger, poverty, displacement, and disaster. And we're going to go right into community organizing. It's lifting up stories of immigrants and refugees. And I think, Myrna, you'll take it from here, right?
Yeah, so we have kind of 4 objectives that we'll touch on, some more than others around this. So we'll talk a little bit more about lifting up the refugee voice how congregations and others can lift up the diverse experiences of refugees and immigrants as part of driving systemic change in your community, what that looks like. And we'll talk a little bit more about some best practices and do's and don'ts in that area. Noel will also be sharing a little bit more about inclusive congregations and how we can create congregations that are inclusive, where immigrants and refugees feel welcome and can flourish. We will also be talking about, if you want to go to the next slide, a little bit more about trauma-informed solidarity. That's more Noel's area of expertise than mine. Still something that I'm trying to do and figure out. My therapist helps, but it is a lot of work there, and discovering new tools that we can use to work with impacted leaders as we invite people to tell their stories, some of which sometimes come, as we know, with a lot of trauma. People have been, in the refugee resettlement space because they're forced to flee, usually not because of good things happening. And so what does that look like as we work with immigrant and refugee communities moving forward? And then one of my favorite parts, the leadership development for social change, making sure that we share a little bit more about what type of training and work that we do there around public narrative and how important leadership development is, both as a tool for empowering folks, but also to be able to create the change that we want to see in our communities. But we're going to start with the first things first, definitions. Our program here at CWS is our advocacy program, and there's kind of two departments under the advocacy program, one being the advocacy and then community organizing. So advocacy for us is a deliberate process to directly and indirectly influence decision makers, so our elected officials or even others at the local and city level that have power, to address the root causes of injustice, feel human rights, and promote the well-being for all. It can take many forms. Right now, actually, Noel and a lot of our staff are in Washington, D.C. participating in advocacy days, where we have faith leaders, we have allies, we have immigrants and refugees talking to elected officials about the issues that we care about and the issues that CWS is advocating on. And so advocacy can look like that, influence that legislation, educating policymakers, which is what they're doing, creating action alerts, speaking on panels, and participating in key coalitions and campaigns to make sure that we're moving whatever that policy, whether it's at the local level or at the national level, forward. A part of that and a component of what we like to say is also community organizing, which is the process of building collective power to win concrete improvements in people's lives by engaging and training refugees, former refugees, and immigrants through the community organizing models. And in advocacy, we help them build more welcoming communities in their states and localities. Now, it is important to know that these things go together. Like, I can't just say, hey, my community wants to make sure that, children are able to enroll in school. Like, what is the policy that needs to be created or drafted to have that happen? And so those things go hand in hand. Similar to any legislation that you all know about, we need to be able to garner enough support for it at the local level, usually from immigrants, refugees, and those that care about immigrants and refugees, to be able to also engage in that, so our lawmakers and those that are there representing us can make sure that they take our interests into consideration when they are legislating things that affect all of our lives. So they go hand in hand, but they are specifically different because community organizing is working mostly directly, at least in our program at CWS, working directly with impacted leaders and former refugees and immigrants. If we can go to the next slide, our purpose on our team, and I'm so sorry the picture didn't come out as strong on this slide, but that's us in DC, is basically to shapen and strengthen the voices of the folks that we seek to empower, to influence those key stakeholders and lawmakers around attitudes, policies, and resources, both in the US and abroad. That's like our large team, because we do both have domestic and international advocacy programming. So this is a part of our team during our last one of our visits, not this one, but in DC previously. We're a good looking team, y'all, can I say? And so what else do we do and what does that look like? So we work with resettled communities, as we mentioned, to identify issues that they care about to create change. So the top picture right there is probably one of our issue advocacy campaigns. So when we decide to advocate for certain policies, we don't just say, I, Myrna, think it's a great idea if we were to pass free housing for all or something crazy. I can't just come up with that and say that that's what we're going to advocate on or think about passing a policy on, but rather we take it to the community and say, like, what issues are affecting you right now? What would you like to change in your community? What is something that you need to be able to thrive? And we do that through issue identification workshops. And once we identify some of the issues, we work with our policy and advocacy team to be able to say, hey, housing is something that our new communities are talking about as an issue. What are some things that we can do to help them navigate that? Or, many states have an Office of New Americans, and my state doesn't. Is this a possibility that we can do or have in our state so that we can be able to direct resources to our community, and so forth? And we also hold a series of trainings to build the leadership and change the public narrative. So issue identification is one of those trainings, but we also educate folks on government 101, how a bill becomes a law, how they can know their rights, organizing 101, and building relationships. We talk a little bit about story of self us now, which is learning how to tell our stories and share our stories to advocate for change and change the public narrative. We also work on civic engagement and making sure that new Americans are able to vote and have their voices heard, advocacy meetings with our elected officials, and issue and campaign strategy development, right? So once something and an issue is identified, it's not just the policy, but it's a whole campaign of like, how do we move this forward? So if we want an Office of New Americans, who is a legislator that can introduce that? What communities do we have to talk to? What coalitions do we have to form, and what timeline does that look like? So it's a lot of that work that happens at the local and national level. We also want to make sure that as many people are informed as possible about those priorities and what we're working on at all levels of government and in our communities. And we work with our policy team to ensure that we engage around those issues, and that our issue areas, where our issue areas overlap, we are able to get the support of our whole team as appropriate or when needed. So that is, in a nutshell, a little bit about what we do. And so we want to talk a little bit more also about faith allyship and ethical ways to engage impacted leaders with lived experience. And so I'm going to pass it over to Noel a little bit because I know he's a bit short of time to also talk about some of those two objectives. And we'll go through a series of slides with just information about how to engage in this work, and why we're saying in ethical ways to engage with impacted leaders with lived experience. So pass it over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's a really powerful combination, faith communities working with impacted leaders. And in this case, we're talking about refugees and immigrants, people with lived experience. And, there can be some helpful ways to go about that partnership. And then there can be, some not helpful ways. And so we're going to talk about that. And these are a couple, rally in North Carolina, an interfaith rally in support of refugees when the numbers were getting cut during the Trump administration, and similar rally in Columbus, Ohio. You see one of our organizers, Jackie Kafuko, who was also a refugee herself, speaking there. And go to the next slide. So, as mentioned, this is a critical part of how we impact the policies we're trying to influence, is the storytelling, the work of impacted leaders themselves. And it's central to everything we do in lifting up those stories. Through the telling of stories, we can create and shape the public narrative that's often, an anti-immigrant narrative. And so we can push back and try to more focus on contributions and make sure that the stories and voices of those impacted are actually lifted up in the media and social media, as well as amongst our congregations. So sometimes, though, allies might misalign their good intentions. And that's why really I think the building of relationships is really the key factor, and having that be an authentic relationship of solidarity. You can go to the next slide. So we always want to work towards equitable leadership structures and develop relationships of trust. We want to recognize that there is definitely a power imbalance. And how can we be clear, though, that impacted community members, they don't owe us something? And this is something that is particularly, important for co-sponsors, because co-sponsors are doing so much work, donations, furniture, helping them with services, buying the services. And we don't want to utilize or use that privilege or power in a way that somehow coercing or making people feel like they have to do something they don't want to do. We want to understand that codependent patterns can develop, but we all know that the self-sufficiency is one of the main goals of refugee resettlement. And then, this question of, well, who shapes the narrative? Like, if people aren't telling their own stories, somebody else is going to tell the story for them. And it may not be very accurate, and it may be full of misinformation. But we always want to come to this work checking our own privilege and understand that we want to respect and nurture the decision making from people impacted, people with lived experience themselves. Next slide. So again, the power of story in our work, it humanizes the issue. We can connect with the audience. A lot of times the facts and figures don't have an emotional connection, but the stories do. We want to, those stories can then be transformational, both to our congregations and to the general public. And it's also a leadership development opportunity for people to be able to tell their own story. It gives people a sense of their own power. And if impacted leaders, as I mentioned before, don't tell their story, someone else will for them. So we can also influence public policy to telling the stories to policymakers themselves. And we can increase our base of support through gaining more supporters who are motivated and moved by these stories. Next slide. But again, we don't want to coerce anybody. We don't want to use our privilege to persuade. It's also not fair to ask people to do something that we haven't helped prepare them to do. So we have to, create the opportunities, or if we don't have them ourselves, we need to reach out to other organizations that can do the education, that can do the training, that can do the preparation. And then also, some people aren't really in the space where they're ready to tell their story. In fact, it can be re-traumatizing, but it can also be healing. So it really is up to that person to gauge themselves. Are they ready to tell their story? Maybe they're not. And maybe we should think about, making sure there's services around the therapy that might be needed first before they're ready to tell their story, and look to how can we accompany people to find those services. We also always want to be looking at the language and cultural barriers. And, if sometimes we get interpretation, sometimes we, go through things many times in English to help with get accustomed to how they want to tell their story, kind of helping them with their pronunciation and whatnot. So there's different ways we can look at also understanding, the different, for example, if we're going to a press conference or if we're going to an interfaith event, really helping people understand what's the purpose of the event, what's the goal of the event, what are we hoping. And I know a lot of people, we've had the experience that a lot of refugees feel frustrated sometimes when they're asked to go to fundraisers. So, what is the goal that we're asking people? Are we asking them to raise money, or are we asking them to help a part of the social change work and power building work and bringing in more people? And the motives and the goals of an event also really influence, how we ask somebody to be part of an event. And then, a lot of times speakers regardless of their background, are provided honorariums. I know I've gotten honorariums before for speaking, right? And so that's another thing to consider. Is this an event where, you know, other speakers are getting a stipend? We do think that in general, when you're asking someone to go speak, it's best to be able to provide some kind of honorarium, even if it's only $50. Oftentimes, it could be a you know 150 or more is a normal stipend or honorarium. So, but that's something to think about ahead of time, right? Is that gonna something that's appropriate for this event, or is it just very grassroots and nobody's getting a stipend and the leader doesn't necessarily want a stipend? So, you know, we want to feel those things out. Next slide. So I wanted to just give an example from our work and, you know, example of somebody who ended up being part of a lot of media, which is one of our leaders, Deborah Jane from Columbus, Ohio. And this was more, you know, several years ago, but and see how the congregation got involved too. So Deborah Jane was a victim of an acid attack, a gender-based violence in Uganda, and she was afraid that her story wasn't valuable or that people wouldn't listen. And so, you know, the first time that she spoke with me or the organizer, Jackie Kafuko, at the time in Columbus, you know, she didn't want to tell her story. And so Jackie was very understanding and you know, Deborah Jane actually went to a training that I was helping lead, and she was able to connect. Deborah was able to connect with the UCC First Community Church, which is DOC and UCC. And at the time, Reverend Kate Shaner really worked to develop a relationship with Deborah Jane, and they actually ended up sponsoring. So Deborah Jane was very motivated to speak, actually, because she wanted to bring her children to the US. She had been separated from her children in the resettlement process. And so that was really the reason why she wanted to speak out against the Trump administration and against the lack of family reunification and the way that the refugee program was getting slashed at the time. And so she ended up, you know, being in all kinds of media outlets, Axios, and I think even the New York Times. And but you know, we practiced with her, and she went to trainings, and she was the one who wanted to tell her story. And actually, the church actually sponsored her children. So the church also helped with the advocacy piece, the behind the scenes piece with the administration and I think it was USCIS. And she actually went to advocate for her children in Uganda. And you can go to the next slide. So her story was actually highlighted in the Netflix documentary Immigration Nation. And you can see a picture of Reverend Kay Shaner, the Columbus or the Community Refugee Immigration Service staff, Jackie Kafuko, a few different church members, and they were able to help her reunite with her family. And she, you know, again, highlighted in a lot of different media and also this very, at the time, very big documentary that came out on Netflix. And so this is just an example of, you know, somebody who didn't want to tell their story, but nobody coerced them to or anything. But she came to the realization that she needed to tell her story to be able to reunite with her children. And so then we provided the training and the support and the leadership development. And the church also provided that same sort of moral support as well as helping with the sponsorship piece of the children. So that you can go to the next slide. Those are some of, I mean, there might be some questions before we get to the action steps about some of these practices, best practices I was laying out, and curious, because I also have to leave a little early to get to a Capitol Hill meeting with our delegation that's waiting for me. So wondering if there's any questions about some of the material I laid out, and then I'll pass it back to Mirna. I mean, while we're waiting for questions, Mirna, you've done this work for so long of working with immigrant communities. Is there anything that you would add to what some of the material that I laid out there about working with impacted leaders and the ethical storytelling work?
Yeah, thanks so much, Noel, and folks that are on. I think, I myself grew up as an undocumented immigrant, and I remember being asked to share my story for the first time, but I didn't know what that meant. Like, was I just supposed to go and tell people I was undocumented, and I really wanted their support to pass the DREAM Act so that I had some ability to normalize my status in the US. And I didn't really understand that. But the Reverend that I was working with, Reverend Laurie Anderson, which is how I started getting involved, really took the time to give me resources about what that meant, and, was cautious in sharing that I didn't have to tell people, anything that I didn't want to share, that I could just, tell them a little bit about why it was so important to me. And happy to just share my experience growing up in Kansas City, which is where I grew up, and my family. And so I think that made me very comfortable. We also just kind of started building a relationship through that. We met up for coffee. She was sharing more about why she was interested in that work and why she was supporting, in that time, the advocacy that we were doing. And I think that part of building relationships was really strong and important, because to me, it wasn't just like a stranger asking me to share my story, right? Like, sometimes we were put in vulnerable positions, and now I knew why she cared, or why she also had a vested interest in that work. And it wasn't as scary for me to trust that I could go to her congregation and share my story. And, like, people would be open and receptive to that, which was really, really great. And we've kept in touch throughout these years. She actually officiated my wedding 10 plus years later after we first met. And so, I think that relationship building and that part is really important, not just to like ask someone to do it, but to build together. We've been able to do a lot of advocacy together throughout the years, and always will support her congregation, as well as some of the work that um we are there. I think one of the questions is, how do we assure them that their stories wouldn't impact their immigration file or processing, and what resources or legal supports are available? That's a really good question. So, I think one of the things, again, in being able to create safe environments for folks, if you're asking them to share their story with your congregation, for example, being able to say, like, we've talked to our congregation about letting them know that, there should be no recording, or that your story is safe with us, and that we won't share it without your consent, is always really helpful. We at the first time when I first shared my story, I was undocumented. I'm not undocumented anymore. But it was very, very helpful for me to understand that they also were connected to local immigration attorneys just in case, and would connect me with someone if I had any questions. So there are members of the American Immigration Lawyers Association that are really open sometimes to come and talk to congregations as well about, like, the legal process of what it looks like for communities to be able to adjust their status. And we can send that as a follow up, in just some of the resources, so that you all can find some of those folks available, or even other immigrant rights organizations that have local attorneys on site. I know CWS offices do as well, and I'm sure they'd be happy to share a little bit more about that. But creating a safe space and just letting folks know that, we won't share your story outside of it. Of this space is really, really important. And then when you are asking them to, hopefully, or maybe they want to share their story with the media or others, we are also more than happy to prepare them on our team, with our media team, to share any resources of, like, do's and don'ts. I mean, when they are coming in through the resettlement process, there shouldn't really be a reason why their story would impact their immigration filer processing, unless they might still have family. But in Deborah's case, as Noel mentioned, that was used to kind of create more advocacy around the fact that she really needed her family here. So it could actually be like a good thing, as more people take notice or advocate on behalf of people. But just creating a safe space, a relationship, letting them know you're not going to share their story without their consent, and being able to talk to folks and members of congregations ahead of time, just letting them know not to do that, I think is really, really helpful. And that's what Lori was able to do, Reverend Lori was able to do with me. That's a great question, though. Any other questions on that? All right, well, feel free to add any of your other questions in the chat. I'll go in to talk a little bit more about what some of the pieces that we're sharing that folks can do. And we'll follow up with some toolkits as well, since there are toolkits on how like faith communities can do this work with more actionable links and resources. Apologies for not getting it on the slides, but we will share it so Finn can hopefully share it out with all of you. But the first thing that we're asking people is just, if you haven't already, just build authentic relationships of solidarity. If you aren't connected with American communities, but that is something that you want to begin or to start, you can just start by reaching out to folks, sharing your story, telling people why you might want to get involved in the advocacy that they're doing, or sharing the advocacy that you and your congregations are doing is always really important. Like I said, I think that was my first step into some of this work as well, just realizing that there were other people that I could trust and that I could build with, especially since my community wasn't ready just yet to be able to be publicly advocating for things like immigration reform or the DREAM Act. And in this case, like now we're advocating for the Afghan Adjustment Act, or several other pieces. And I think that's where everything stems from. Once you're able to build an authentic relationship with folks, the work and the journey together comes more easily. We are also asking communities, and we will be releasing a toolkit shortly on this as well, to take some sort of action on World Refugee Day, which is June 20th this year. We're asking folks to check out any events that might be happening in their local area to come and support. A lot of these events are fun celebrations, so we do encourage you to check those out. I know there will be a map released in the next few weeks of upcoming actions around the country and upcoming events to celebrate World Refugee Day. There's going to be some World Refugee Day proclamations happening in several cities where mayors are putting those out, and resolutions in support of refugees in their community. There will be a whole toolkit. It can range from writing an op-ed to tell people that we support refugees being resettled in our communities, to telling your story about why you care about immigrants and refugees, to having immigrants and refugees come share their stories and talk to folks a little bit more about their advocacy efforts, as we've talked throughout this presentation. But that is coming up. We will have a whole toolkit on it, and you can always also reach out to us with any questions that you might have regarding World Refugee Day. We have a email address that goes to Noel, myself, and our community organizing director, cwsorganizing@cwsglobal.org. So any questions that you might have, we'll also have social media graphics that folks can share so that people can support. And then we're also going to have a digital pledge card. This won't be released until likely late June or July, where we are pledging to vote to support New Americans' ability to get out the vote. So we'll have pledge cards that we're asking folks to sign, basically stating, I pledge to vote in support of immigrants and refugees, or supporting immigrants and refugees that have the right to vote for the first time, and being able to do so, volunteering with them. That can be anything from voter education to giving rights to the polls. Our CWS advocacy and organizing team is going to be working on civic engagement in 8 states. Those are Texas, Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Oregon, where we have organizers. And so if you are in any of those states and want more information about like local events or actions that they will be taking from now until election day, we are happy to share those with you all as well. But those are just some of the few things that we're going to be working on that we're asking folks for support. And so I feel like those are, yes, those are the three, and we'll share more resources out that can be shared to folks via email. Do you want to go to the next slide? I think that's it for today. So happy to take any questions that you all might have around any of this that we shared today. And like I said, we'll follow up with additional resources, but if there's anything that you all have top of mind, happy to.
For all the opportunities that now we know that congregations can take, community members can take, and also kind of just the incredible empowerment that is available to someone and they may not even know. They're like, hey, my story is special, my story is important. But I really loved how in the slide it mentioned, tell your own story before someone else does. Really owning your own story, owning your truth, and sharing that with others is so important. So thank you. Thank you. So we'll just give a few more minutes in case there's any other questions, any other ideas that people want to add. And from there, we'll just bring it to a close. We'll just give a few more minutes for questions.
Thank you so much, Ruben. And while people come off mute or want to share in the chat, I will also just share, it's not just like immigrants and refugees that have stories. You all have stories too. You have a story of why you're doing this work, of why your congregation wants to be involved, and that is part of the key to building an authentic relationship. So just want to make sure that you are also aware that your story also matters, and that it's important for you to be able to also tell your story to your friends, your family, your community, your congregations, and the immigrants and refugees you want to build relationships with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I don't know if it happens with you, Myrna, but every time, let's say someone I just met asks me what I do for a living, or they're confused, they're not really sure what to make out of it, or they're really inspired. They're like, wait, there's people that do this, or they work helping refugees, they work helping immigrants. I'm like, yeah. And then you see them sometimes just glow up, and it's like, wow, that's really inspiring. I want to know more. So yeah, like that goes to say like everyone's story here in this conversation in different agencies and the newcomers as well all comes together to tell a bigger, more powerful story.
Yeah. In the organizing world, we call it the story of us, right? It's not, it's the story of self, the story of now, like why I care about this issue right now. And then the story of us is like why we care about it together and why we're advocating together. So we all collectively are an us, and I encourage you to share that so that folks can really build with each other as we all seek to live out CWS's mission and our own missions in our congregations.
Absolutely.
Just one other thing to add as I'm walking to a Hill meeting on that is the statistics and research has shown actually that when impacted leaders and allies tell their story together, that you can persuade more people because you're kind of essentially reaching a broader audience of people who can identify and associate with the stories being told. So definitely second that thought about how important it is to tell your story as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I love to hear the beep. I wonder if that was no beeping or they were beeping at him. He's definitely on his way.
And I just want to point out, and it's okay if there aren't any questions, all good. That I posted that email on the chat. If you all have any follow-up questions or anything that you might want to see, you can email that, and that goes to our organizing team, and we'd be happy to follow up.
Yeah, and I'm definitely going to follow up with an email with any resources that they have to share. And also, we're going to put the recording on YouTube and we'll put it on the Partner With Us website. And we can also share that with everyone in case you want to watch us speaking one more time or you want to share that with other community members as well.
I think there are no more questions. So thank you all so very much for having me today.
Thank you, everyone, and have a great day. Thank you, Noel, and thank you, Myrna. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.